Welcome to Around the Empire. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and how to gain access to the bonus content. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Our guest today is Mary Dejevsky. We talk about the recent news and press conferences about the recent communications between the US, NATO, and Russia. And we approach this from a realistic view of Russia and Ukraine. Mary Dejevsky is a veteran journalist and columnist. She's a former foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, Washington, and a special correspondent in China. She wrote about the collapse of the USSR from inside Moscow at the time, and she's an expert on the relations between Russia and the Western world. She now writes for several media outlets across the political spectrum. We recorded this on January 29th, 2022. Mary Dejevsky is here speaking to us from London. Hello, Mary. Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to meet you.
Hello, very great pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, so as I was telling Mary, normally I have a sort of a well-planned format, questions, but since this is our first conversation, and since this is a topic that is, changing by the minute, I figured I would leave it more open so we could just chat about what we see going on in our respective places. Probably the two hot spots, although Canada is pretty hot when it comes to Ukraine too. And but I think maybe since it's your first time on this podcast, would you just take a couple of minutes to tell us about yourself?
Yes, at the moment I'm a freelance writer based in London. I used to work for the London Times and the Independent. I was the Times correspondent in Moscow through the collapse of communism, and I was based in Washington and Paris for the Independent and traveled all over the world basically for newspapers. I'm now a writer. I have a weekly column with the Independent of London. I write for a lot of other outlets, quite interestingly, both on the left of the political spectrum in Britain and to the right of the political spectrum in Britain, which pleases me and I find very satisfactory. But mainly I specialize in international affairs, in Russia and the region, but also transatlantic relations. And also I have a sort of sideline in social policy and politics in the UK.
Well, that's really interesting. And you said that you did reporting all through the fall of the USSR and all the shifts.
Yes.
Where were you at that point in time? I think I may have missed.
Yeah. No, I was based in Moscow, and of course I traveled all over the former USSR as it was in the state of collapse. But I had a sort of long history, although I'm, as you can probably hear, completely English. I studied Russian and German at Oxford. And I started with the BBC and I specialized in that part of the world. And amazingly, really, for a newspaper, I was sent by the editor to Moscow to cover what looked like the enormous transition that was going on when Gorbachev became Soviet leader. And he sent me to Moscow specifically because I spoke Russian and because I'd traveled there. As a student, I spent a year in the Russian provinces on the British academic exchange. So my Russian was pretty competent. And also I had experience of parts of Russia that really quite a lot of people, at least at that stage, didn't get to see. So the editor decided, which was quite a revolutionary thing for a British newspaper editor to decide, that he would send somebody who actually had some idea of the country they were being sent to. And that was, I think it was, obviously it was incredibly interesting for me, but it was probably also a benefit of to the newspaper as well.
Yeah, wow. I'd love to know more about that at some point in time. Were you, by any chance, were you there in the 90s as well, or any of the 90s?
No, I mean, I left at the end of '92. So I saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, I saw the start of the Yeltsin era. But through the second half of the '90s, I didn't go to Russia at all. And I started going back in the early 2000s. I mean, in 2001, I started going back and I started writing about Russia again. And one of the reasons I started writing about it, having practically sworn to myself in 1992 that I'd had enough of this country, I'd done Russia for how many years, and I wanted to do something else. In 2001, the reason I started writing about Russia again was because I felt that the reporting was so unbelievably negative in the English-speaking world. And I wanted to try to put the Russia of the early 2000s, at least, into some sort of context, because people were saying, oh, it's right back to the Soviet Union. People had no idea how it was in the Soviet Union. And they were comparing it, they were making a comparison that really shouldn't have existed. And the lack of even a short-term historical context, I still feel, is a gigantic liability in reporting Russia today.
Yeah, I mean, and that's still the case here, particularly our political leaders. They still talk about Russia as if it's the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
And we're like,
yes.
What? You know, I mean, I've never been to Russia. I didn't even know that much about Russia until the Maidan happened, when it caught my attention, and it has ever since. And I've learned a lot, made contacts. I learned a lot from Stephen Cohen, who also is one of the few people who presents a realistic view. I mean, I don't know if you would say he was a Russophile or whatever, but he definitely had a fondness of the country, but a realistic view. He, it's not so much that he wouldn't ever say anything bad about it or whatever, but not only is it not the Soviet Union anymore, but the transformation over the last 20 years, particularly the last 10, just amazing.
Yes, yeah.
In my view, what I don't know that much about is Russia before the Soviet Union. And, there's so many things I want to learn more about, but but I mean, there was a period of time during the War on Terror when I think a lot of our Russia specialists and speakers were, feeling less underemployed or whatever. But boy, that has changed. That is really back into. I mean, you're uniquely positioned right now to understand and report and help other people understand this situation, to be able to do good analysis, because there isn't much good analysis.
I just say there, one of the really interesting things about this particular crisis, we've had a history of Russian-Ukrainian tensions for goodness knows how long. We had the crisis in 2014 with the annexation by Russia of Crimea and the political change, really something like a popular uprising in Kiev. And we had all that, but I don't remember really even then that the interest was as great as it is now, at least in the UK. I have to say, I've been busier over the last 10 days writing or speaking about Russia and Ukraine, far, far busier on those subjects than I've been really at any crisis in that region that I can remember. And there seems, at least, even as a lot of the coverage has been very stereotypical, very cliched, Russia bad, Ukraine good, Europe out of the picture. Nonetheless, there seems to be an interest out there to try to find out something more about what's going on. And there've been some of the most interesting, some of the most nuanced panel discussions that either I've been part of or that I've been watching in the last week or so, which I think is really quite interesting and quite a positive development.
Yeah, that's encouraging. And at a time when we really need some encouraging news, in my view. That's good. That's great to hear. Now, I'm trying to decide whether, I mean, there's interest because there seems to be a big threat, and
Yes.
it's being hyped up here. Frankly, I don't watch the mainstream news as much as I do. Really, not very much at all. I pick up, I go through feeds of headlines and things like that. I do more reading than watching. Cable news is just not even, it's not watchable anymore here. And so there's that. So I'm more of then there's a lot of good independent media. So, I get a lot of what I need from there. So at least I guess more people, maybe they are more familiar with Ukraine now than they were before. There wasn't a lot of interest in the 2014 period of time. But yeah, I do see more of an interest. I still don't see enough interest to, I don't know, to bring up the percentages of people who are willing to go fight for it.
Yeah.
So, there's that. But I am afraid, though, that I am not seeing that nuance except in independent media.
Mm-hmm.
So, but maybe what you're seeing, maybe that shift will happen here. I hope so. So let's see where to start. Maybe we can just talk about what has transpired over the last few days. There was a sudden press conferences, Blinken and Stoltenberg, and I don't know if there was any particular thing that triggered delivering that response, that written response to the Russians by our ambassador, but everything seemed to just break out that day. Although, as best I can tell, it was kind of a nothing burger. I don't think it changed much. Is that accurate?
I think maybe you're being slightly too pessimistic. I mean, certainly as it came across in as it were, the official words, it sounded as though in their formal reply to basically the Russian challenge to say, come and talk to us about Ukraine and about new arrangements for European security. And this was the formal response that the US was delivering to Russia. And yes, it has to be said that it appeared that nobody was particularly impressed. The Russians were quite, they were maybe a bit hesitant, but they said the replies were basically inadequate. And as you say, we had practically 2 days of almost non-stop press conferences, of appearances. We had Antony Blinken, we had NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, we had the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. We had yesterday afternoon, we had something which I think has been rather underplayed. We had a 90-minute press conference from Ukraine's leader, President Zelensky. And all these things were happening in the space of 48 hours. So, but it seemed to me that at least between the lines of what the Russians and the Americans were saying, there was an attempt not at least to exacerbate things, not to make things worse than they already were. And one of the things that struck me about Stoltenberg's press conference particularly was that he really went to great lengths to make a distinction between what NATO would do if members of the alliance were attacked. So we're talking about, say, the Baltic states, Poland here. And what would happen if Ukraine were attacked? Because Ukraine isn't a member of NATO. And there's been quite a disagreement simmering beneath the surface, both of NATO and of the European Union, between those members who think that basically Ukraine should be treated as a sort of forward position of NATO, as a defender of the first outpost, the first defender of Europe against a malevolent Russia, and who think that NATO ought to rush to Ukraine's aid with troops, as well as providing what it's been providing so far, which is basically defensive armaments and not huge quantities of that. And Stoltenberg, who has never struck me, he's always struck me as being very hard line and really without very many shades of grey in between.
Exactly.
But he was very keen to make that distinction and admit that there were differences in NATO about what to do if Ukraine were attacked. But what he made very clear was that Ukraine, because it wasn't a member of NATO, would not be subject to the Article 5 protections, that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that any response would basically have to stop at sanctions, however swinging those sanctions were. He made it very clear, which was quite a surprise to me, that there wouldn't be NATO military action unless NATO members came under attack. And I think that was quite an important thing for him to put on record. And I think he felt that it was an important thing. And I think it's a message that was directed very clearly to Russia. So I think that was interesting. I think also that although the headline of all these press conferences was very much, we don't accept the Russian position, we're not going to make concessions on the Western side. Nonetheless, there seemed to be a willingness, both by the Americans and by Lavrov, to say, well, the talking should go on, and there are things that we can talk about. Those things probably don't include Ukraine, which of course wouldn't please the Western side particularly, but they could include these things called confidence building measures, about pulling back troops, about not stationing particular weapons in particular parts of Europe. And I think that is quite fertile ground for a possible conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I watched the Stoltenberg and the Blinken press conferences. I did not see Lavrov and I didn't see Zelensky. I caught some statements from Lavrov. Now, what I heard in the Stoltenberg was that that NATO, separately from the U.S., delivered a message to the foreign ministry, Russian foreign ministry,
yes,
and that he had statements from all 30 NATO members. It seemed like he was trying to emphasize that, which surprised me because, my impression has certainly been that there are some wide-ranging, there are some dissenters,
yes,
like big time. So, and then in Blinken's presser, he emphasized that the US and NATO separately delivered messages, and that he was, basically saying that the US doesn't drive NATO, we can't just snap our fingers and all of NATO. Yeah. So, which a lot of people think that the US calls all the shots in NATO. And I don't think that's true. I think that, we pay all the money, so it gives you a lot of leverage. But right now, I think some countries are just drawing the line. And then one of the things go ahead. Yeah.
I think, one reason why there were two responses is because back in December, Russia put out these two documents, and it presented in the form of what it said were draft treaties. But some people said, well, they were ultimatums, and other people said, well, actually, my view was that these were really a sort of opening bid to try and start some sort of talks. But the reason why there were two responses is because there were two documents, and they were different documents. And one was presented to the United States, and the other one was presented to NATO. And so the responses came from had to come from those two places to the respective documents.
Oh, that makes
there was
sense.
something in common, but there was not as much crossover as you might have imagined. Now, of course, in the middle of all that, there is a group that felt rather bypassed, which was the European Union, and they were saying, well, you know, why aren't we being talked to? Why is Russia presenting draft treaties to the United States and to NATO, but it's not presenting anything to us? So they felt a bit left out, and so there have been various attempts, either by individual members or by the European Union, to try and put itself back in the frame. The Macron of France talked to Putin yesterday, Friday, over the phone, and there was a meeting, I think Wednesday or Thursday, I can't quite remember, of what was called the Normandy format groups, that basically the Europeans who'd tried to negotiate an agreement after 2014 between Russia and Ukraine.
Right. And the impression I got was that the Minsk, you know, the resume of the Minsk talks was not so much what came out of it, but just the fact that they brought it together at this point in time. Did anything significant come out of those talks, or was it just that they, you know, reconvened?
No, I mean, I agree with you. It didn't seem that anything particular had come out of it. But the fact that they'd met again after quite a long gap, and the fact that people were talking again about the Minsk agreement, even though, you know, practically everybody who talks about the Minsk agreement says, well, it's absolutely useless, there are all sorts of unacceptable things in there, it's no wonder it's come to nothing. Nonetheless, the fact that the fact that talking resumed in a format which had existed before, I mean, it's obviously better that happens than it doesn't happen. That's probably all you can say.
Yeah. And I don't know, I could be wrong, but it also seemed to, the United States was not there. You know, France and Germany were there with Russia and quote unquote Ukraine, whoever Zelensky sends. So it's sort of registered some dissent as well. But, you know, the Minsk agreements and all the talks, I watched those for a long time with, you know, with great frustration, because it seems to be a complete gridlock. I don't, it doesn't seem like there's a political solution. And frankly, that is what worries me the most, is that even if Zelensky did want to follow through, you know, to give the range of autonomy to Eastern Europe to allow them to hold some elections and the other things in that agreement, the ultra nationalist factions that seem to be the enforcers, whose enforcers they are exactly, not entirely sure. A lot of people would say they're NATO's enforcers. They're on this side, they would say it's, you know, the neocon hawk enforcers, that they would just not allow that to happen. So where do you go from here? If you're Russia, if you're looking at things from their perspective, you know, what options do they have? The only thing I ever hear from the United States, Britain, and NATO is, you know, do what we say. We're not going to give an inch. So we're never going to get anywhere. And this is why I think, whereas I would have, you know, completely poo-pooed any suggestion of Russian invasion or, you know, intervention or things like that in the past, I would have sort of laughed about that because, you know, I don't know, Christopher Miller and some of the people in Kiev, they spent all kinds of time, and the media here, they talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine all the time. And there used to be like outbursts of headlines of that every so often. And it just got to be ridiculous. Like, there was no Russian invasion. There was, you know, there were either contract or special forces or whatever, clearly Russian military or contractors of some sort from the start. And I guess, I don't know how much they're involved now, but a lot, I would imagine. Some vague entity has always been involved, but there was never any invasion. So, but now I actually think there could be. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly. I mean, for about the last 10 days, I've been most worried about the rhetoric that seems to have been launched almost exclusively on the Western side, and not by the whole of the West, but from the United States and from the UK. There's been this absolute, almost panicked, alarming rhetoric that Russia is going to mount an imminent invasion of Ukraine. And it's and we had the British Foreign Secretary was on the radio about 3 days ago, on the main political program of the morning program of the BBC, and she said there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops poised on the Ukrainian border. Now, this is not only completely wrong, because the standard figure given is 100,000, but even that, I think, needs to be challenged as to exactly where they are and exactly how close to the border they are and what exactly they're doing. But to talk about hundreds of thousands is totally irresponsible, and yet she wasn't challenged on that at all. In her position, that's not something that somebody in her position should be saying. Somebody in a leading political position should not be driving up the hostile rhetoric, because the more that happens, and it's happened so much over the last 10 days. I was one of the people who started out when the first alarms were struck, as saying, I don't believe Russia is going to invade.
Yeah, me too.
Because it seemed to me so totally counterproductive for Russia to invade anybody, least of all Ukraine, in the winter, with battles that Ukraine would fight, Ukrainians would fight. You're not talking about 2014. You're talking about something much, much worse. And it didn't seem to me that, it also seemed that it would be hugely unpopular in Russia. There was no reason why Russia would invade Ukraine. The problem was that as the rhetoric ratcheted up on the West, exclusively on the Western side, that you then start getting Russia becoming more jumpy, becoming more apprehensive. The degree to which Russia genuinely fears the West and NATO as presenting a superior military force, I don't think that's sufficiently appreciated in much of the Western world. And all the war talk, it seemed, was making things incredibly dangerous. It was making it possible mistakes, possible overreaction from the Russian side. It was making a conflict that didn't seem to be on the horizon 2 weeks before. It was suddenly making it plausible. And I just thought that was complete madness. And it was madness that largely came from the Western side.
It is madness. And I'm kind of, I was kind of hoping you would say that you didn't see it the same way that I did. Yeah. But I mean, part of this is hard to explain too. It's, you've been watching, and particularly you watching it so closely for so long, you're going to detect differences in the ways things have played out before. And, whatever instinct, I would call it, it's just another form of analysis based on so much information that's, in your brain. But I definitely detect something different, whether it's a frustration on the Russian part. When I started looking at it from their side, the political impasse, like what options do they have if they want to try to work something out with Ukraine? There are people who are, preventing that from ever happening. And if somebody just keeps saying, if you make an offer and you're trying to negotiate, and they just keep saying, well, no, we want this and we want more, and you can't have what you want. That's what I see happening and have seen for a long time. And then at the same time, just accusing them of things that really are not true or are not accurate in the bigger picture. So, I see a belligerence in the Russians that I don't think I've seen before. In Lavrov, he's always had sort of a snarky attitude when dealing this kind of thing. But this time I see something, I think I see something different, like openly coming out and insulting Stoltenberg, saying he's not in reality. And so that kind of thing. Maybe they're just trying a different approach. I haven't heard much lately about the pressures on Putin from the quote unquote hardliners in the Kremlin. So I don't really know much about that. And I also wonder if the difference in their reaction is because of something they're seeing that's not being talked about. And I'll just also say that in the Blinken press conference, I've been following Matt Lee from Associated Press for years now. And, the first thing he did, he was just trying to boil it down after the speech. He's like, basically, I'm paraphrasing. He's like, so basically you said no, right? That's what he says to Blinken. And Blinken kind of doesn't admit that they said no, but he does say that there was nothing in the response documents that hadn't been said publicly. But then he didn't make them public. And I don't believe that's the only thing that was in there. There are a number of people who are saying the negotiations are about more than what appears on the surface, whether that be missile positioning. And I guess the other sort of dot that I'm connecting is that for some reason, the CIA decided to come out and reveal the fact that they have paramilitaries who've been on the ground in some capacity for, I guess, since 2014 or 15. Why they decided to reveal that now. I'm like, so those are some of the factors that went into my gut feeling on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to make one other point, really, which I think I find it very interesting, and I think it may be one of the reasons why opinion in the UK, public opinion and specialist opinion at least, has become a little more curious and a little less stereotyped in recent days than it has been until now. And that's basically the increasing attention given to Ukraine, because of course so much is actually about Ukraine. But a couple of weeks ago, we hardly heard anything direct from Ukraine. Now, what's happened in the last few days is that there's been quite a to and fro between the United States and Zelensky's office about what exactly the information that he's getting from the United States as to whether an invasion is imminent. And he says that the Russians are telling him that, but he doesn't completely believe it. And at his press conference yesterday, I have to say that I covered some of his election campaign when he was elected president 2 years ago as a complete novice. Everybody said, oh, he knows nothing, he's just a satirical actor. At his press conference yesterday, he was very impressive. He was very calm, he was very measured. And he said, look, people are pointing out differences between me and President Biden, because I'm saying we need to keep calm. We don't see evidence of an imminent Russian invasion. We don't think it has to happen. And anyway, we've had a real war in the east of our country for the last 8 years. So to talk about an invasion, it may be an increased threat, but we've been experiencing a real war so that there might be a difference in scale, but you're underestimating us if you think that we're going to panic at this the first signs of alarm from the West. And when he said something very interesting, because he was challenged by one of the reporters at the press conference to say, you, President Zelensky, said that I know about your difference of opinion with President Biden. You said, well, I know my country and he knows his country. And the reporter challenged him and said, what is it that you know about your country that makes you so confident that this, that, and the other? And he said, I've traveled all over my country. I know my people, and I've been out to the east, and I know I know what's happening on the ground. I know the sentiment of Ukrainians. And he said, and he spoke with an entire confidence. And when he was asked about the intelligence, because it's often said that the US passes its intelligence about Russian troop movements to Ukraine. And he came back immediately and he said, okay, well, yes, we're getting American intelligence reports. But what about those American intelligence reports that actually didn't forecast that Kabul was going to fall to the Taliban when it did? That was American intelligence. And he had another couple of cases where he said that in April, the Americans had told him that the Russians were withdrawing their troops away from Ukraine's border. And he said, well, that's what we were told by American intelligence. But he said, I think that was because that was the message that that was the message that the United States wanted to send to the world. But he said it wasn't true. We could see across the border and that wasn't happening. So Zelensky was explaining why there was a difference in tone and in content between what he was thinking about the situation and what the Americans and the British were thinking about the situation. And I found that he came across in a very convincing way, and really as a very competent politician in speaking both to his own people and to the international media that he had in front of him. And I think that's both what he said yesterday and the fact that there are now quite a few British correspondents scattered around Ukraine. There are some of them who've been sort of embedded with Ukrainian army troops in the east of the country, which has been at war. Some of them have been obviously taken by the British to be shown how the British are training Ukrainian army troops to fight if necessary, which is a sort of propaganda element by the British.
Justify the money and things,
Yes, but the interesting thing is that several of those correspondents, including for the BBC and for newspapers, they go to Kiev or they go to other big cities in Ukraine. And what they've been reporting since they've been there is, with some degree of astonishment, the mismatch that they are seeing between the mood in the cities that they're staying in and the mood as they saw it before they arrived there in the UK or the US. That the talking up of the alarm is simply not there. And when they talk to ordinary people in Kiev or in Lviv in the West, and they talk to them and they say, well, we don't want war, but we don't see signs that war is going to happen. And Zelensky said, well, you can call me naive afterwards if it happens, but if it happens, we're prepared. But I think it's that difference in mood and tone between Ukraine itself and what's being put about in the Western world that has maybe slightly started to change the tone of reporting, at least in the UK.
Well, I'm glad there's people on the ground then, because otherwise they can just, they could tell us anything they want. Recall in Syria where there were areas that were quote unquote rebel held, where the only news coming out of
Absolutely.
them was,
Yes.
and if Ukraine becomes that kind of a situation, just sort
Yeah.
of controlled information, that's of course why, I spend so much time looking for people on the ground who could speak English, which was
Mhm.
not an easy task back in 2014. But you're looking for those people on the ground, just looking for good information. Tough to
Yeah.
do these days, but that's very interesting. Now, I mean, they are a hardened population, right? They've been
Mhm.
through a lot,
Yes. Yeah.
but if they don't feel war in the air, I mean, that says a
Exactly.
lot. You
Mhm.
know what I've seen here? I've seen a couple of sort of man on the street interviews that are being
Mhm.
pushed here about Ukrainians who are asked, well, what are you going to do when the Russians invade, or if the Russians invade? And then of course they're like, well, I guess I'll get my guns and I'll fight them. And then there's a picture of a woman with this giant rifle, and
Oh yes. Yeah, I think I've
you
seen the
see
same
that one?
picture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it was as tall as her, that rifle. But
Mm.
and it just reminded me of, not that I don't want to take us completely off track, but there was one particular speech that Zbigniew Brzezinski gave one time at the Wilson Center. I want to say 2013, 14, 15 timeframe.
Mhm.
And he talked about how he, I don't want to say he hoped, but he talked about a scenario in which, the Russians came into Ukraine, and that we should arm Ukrainian civilians so they can do hand-to-hand combat and knives and guns and just fight them on the streets. And I just sat there with my jaw dropped when he
Yeah.
was saying these things. Plus, as good as he could be on some analysis, as his when Russia came to the picture, it just seemed to go haywire. And in that particular
Yes. Yeah.
case, more haywire than I had ever seen. He scared me. I was like,
Mhm.
oh, back away slowly.
If Ukraine has to be supported so that it does resist, the Ukrainians have to know that the West is prepared to help them resist. And there's no reason to be secretive about it. It would be much better to be open about it and to say to the Ukrainians and to those who may threaten Ukraine that if you resist, if you Ukrainians resist, you will have weapons, and we'll provide some of those weapons in advance of the very act of invasion. Because in the absence of that, the temptation to invade and to preempt may become overwhelming. But what kind of weapons is important? And in my view, these should be weapons designed particularly to permit the Ukrainians to engage in effective urban warfare of resistance. There's no point trying to arm the Ukrainians who take on the Russian army in the open field. Thousands of tanks, modern army, well organized for some purposes, overwhelming force. But there is a history to be learned from urban resistance in World War II, and most recently in Grozny, Chechnya, which resisted for 3 months in house-to-house fighting. And there are some moving examples from World War II, which I do not need to reiterate. The point is, if the effort to invade was to be successful politically, it would have to incorporate taking the major cities. If the major cities, say Kharkiv, say Kiev, were to resist and street fighting became a necessity, it would be prolonged and costly. And the fact of the matter is, and this is where the timing of this whole crisis is important, Russia is not yet ready to undertake that kind of an effort. It will be too costly in blood, paralyzingly costly in finances. And it would take a long time and create more and more international pressure. So I feel that we should make it clear to the Ukrainians that if you are determined to resist, as they say they are, and seemingly they're trying to do so, though not very effectively, we'll provide them with anti-tank weapons, handheld anti-tank weapons, handheld rockets, weapons capable for use in urban short-range fighting. This is not an arming of Ukraine for some invasion of Russia. You don't invade a country as large as Russia with defensive weaponry. But if you have defensive weaponry and you have access to it and you know it's arriving, you're more likely to resist. And hence that acts as a deterrence. And that in turn can permit then more effective operations to terminate some of the violence that is being sponsored on the borders between Ukraine and Russia. That, I think, would help in any case to contain the risk and the temptation to resolve this issue by force of arms. On the Russian side, in the context of a mood of great ecstasy over the Crimean success, which was quick and decisive and which encountered no resistance. The temptation to seek its repetition can be quite strong and appealing to a political leader who desperately needs a major success.
So, and then, they put this on our television as if maybe trying to convince us that, oh, these Ukrainians are tough. And even if their military failed last time, the people are going to come out and they're going to, they're going to fight the Russians with bayonets or something. I don't know. So, now I lost my train of thought. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. There was a lot of talk here about sort of ribbing Biden about, hey, we heard that Zelensky is, not happy with you, or your talk, it didn't go well. And the Biden administration, I believe their reaction was they don't want to admit that there was any kind of difference between the two. And then I did catch a couple of quotes from Zelensky's speech. I didn't watch it. I will though, because I'm interested in the body language and all. But he did say something, or at least what I saw quoted was something like, basically saying, well, instead of doing preemptive sanctions, just bring us into NATO. It sounded like he said something like that. Was that accurate? Or maybe taken out of context?
That's not quite what I understood. I understood that he was saying that Ukraine would like the West to impose sanctions sort of before a Russian invasion rather than after it.
Makes sense.
Which seemed completely unrealistic.
Unrealistic.
What he said about NATO, as I understood it, was that he said, well, you need to decide and you need to tell us if we've got no chance of being in NATO ever, then you should put that on the line and you should tell us that direct, because at the moment, he said, well, it was all too uncertain. So I saw those two things differently rather than as in the same sentence, as it were. But
okay.
That's how I remember it.
So it was more of a now that the rubber is meeting the road, or potentially, why should we go through all of this if you're never going to let us into NATO anyway?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
wonder.
He also had quite an interesting point, which was basically he alluded, though he didn't really say directly, that all the talk of a Russian invasion had an absolutely devastating effect on the Ukrainian economy, and that investors had basically withdrawn investments, and he said that if you really want to help us, what you'll do is you'll keep investing and you'll give us special financial terms, and what we need is that sort of help. So, and somebody said, well, on the one hand, you're telling us that there's not going to be an invasion and everything's fine and you're all calm. And on the other hand, you're saying, please, our economy is in desperate straits. We'd like some money. And in a way, he was saying that. But that wasn't a stupid thing for him to be saying in Ukraine's current position.
Yeah, I did see that. I think I saw some numbers in the billions tossed around where
Yes.
our lawmakers are talking about, I may be getting aid and weapons money mixed up, but in the hundreds of millions. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, obviously they need money to keep going. And
Yes.
I guess, is this the first winter where, what's the situation with gas? Is gas still flowing into
Yes,
Ukraine?
gas is still flowing. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any problem about it. And in a way, it hadn't occurred to me until you mentioned it. But you know, if Russia wanted to punish Ukraine and really make things difficult for Ukraine, it would cut off the gas supply. But there hasn't been any indication of that. There's actually been no talk at all about gas supplies or gas prices or gas contracts between Russia and Ukraine for months. So you have to assume that the gas is flowing as normal.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to let you go soon, but did you see, I of course I have a million questions. Did you see the statement by Victoria Nuland about calling on China to, it was just ridiculous. If you didn't see it, I won't bring it up.
No, I mean, I saw just some passing remarks by Wendy Sherman saying that probably because Russia would want to keep China sweet, and so they were probably not going to do anything through the Beijing Winter Olympics. So everybody could relax for a couple of weeks, and then we should all be on special alert after the end of the Beijing Olympics. I mean, I just think that's completely ridiculous. I mean, given that I don't think there is likely to be an invasion at all, I particularly don't think that the Beijing Olympics is a fact.
Before I forget, a lot of people have been laying out the scenarios, what the Russians might do, right? There's sometimes 3, 5 scenarios or whatever. But one scenario I had not considered, well, first of all, I had never taken the coup option seriously until recently, until I started thinking of it as a political impasse type of thing. And so, okay, maybe that is a possibility. But after talking to you, it actually occurred to me, I mean, I'm just spitballing here. What if it's not so much a coup, but if the Russians moved in to help Zelensky implement the Minsk agreement and to sort of fight off the people who would come after him? I hadn't really thought about that as an option, but I don't know, just.
Well, I mean, I have to say that when people were talking about an invasion and presenting all the different scenarios, the scenario that seemed to me the most plausible was that the Russians might cross the border just into the area of conflict, and they might sit there as an occupying force and say, right, we're going to stay here until everybody's agreed on the Minsk proposals, which were agreed in principle all those years ago, and that they would basically present themselves as guardians of the Minsk Accords, and that they would say, we will withdraw when those 2 provinces in the east of Ukraine are established as an autonomous region within an integrated Ukraine, and there's a proper border demarcated between Russia and Ukraine, then we'll leave. And of course, that would be totally unacceptable to the Western side. There is no way that that would be tolerated. But that was the only scenario that I could envisage as being a realistic one. the prospect of a coup or Russia installing a pro-Russian government in Kiev, the British were terribly pleased about that, and they put out this sort of special intelligence that they said they had. Which they'd specially declassified for the media, which named, I think, 4 or 5 individuals that they said were the sort of leadership in waiting. But then a few people sort of investigated who these individuals were, and it turned out that, I mean, one of them actually expressly denied that he had anything to do with it, any interest in it, or was in a position to be involved in it at all. But it also occurred to me that, not only was it completely unrealistic, whoever was involved, but the idea of Russia being able to install a pro-Russian government in Kiev and removing the current leadership to accommodate them. 8 years ago, you had a popular uprising on the streets of Kiev, which ousted a leader who had rejected an agreement with the European Union. Now, the idea that that wouldn't happen again if there was a leadership imposed from outside the country, whoever it was imposed by, of course, if that was the mood of Kiev 8 years ago, I would say that it's doubly, trebly the mood of Kiev now. So I think of all the scenarios that was suggested, that was one of the least plausible.
Interesting. I'm going to try to share screen and show you this Victoria Nuland thing. Let's see if it works.
We are calling on Beijing to use its influence with Moscow to urge diplomacy, because if there is a conflict in Ukraine, it is not going to be good for China either. There will be a significant impact on the global economy. There'll be a significant impact in the energy sphere, and it will be all the harder for all of us to get back to what we should be doing, which is building back better.
I just find
that was my reaction too. Yeah,
I just find it completely implausible. But I also have to say that I've been at panel discussions over the last couple of weeks where there's always been 1 or 2 questions which say, well, what about China? And I have to say that I almost completely switch off at that, because it seems to me that whatever the outcome in Ukraine, there really is, it's maybe one of the few things in the world where there really isn't a China angle, at least in the immediate term, and possibly
other than maybe their investment, being nervous about investments. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they leave that all to Russia, don't you think?
Yes, it simply doesn't seem to me to be a plausible angle, and the idea that you could sort of recruit China to say to Russia, "Look, calm down, don't go into Ukraine." I don't think it's something on China's horizon.
Yeah, I think you're being very kind. All right. Well, on that note, of course, I would like to talk to you for another hour, but I should really let you go.
Me too.
I wonder if you do have another 5 or 10 minutes for a bonus question. If not, don't worry about it.
I'll do one bonus question.
Okay. This one should be an easy one for you. All right. So, from my impression, a lot of the hostility toward Russia in the Western world is centered in the UK, is centered in Britain. Or let me just put it, maybe that's not accurate. There seems to be an incredible amount of hatred for Russia in the UK, and I don't understand it. I don't really know why. That's probably a really naive question, but if you could sort of fill me in, that would be great. I could really help benefit by understanding that. Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. If you would, please let everyone know, I know you mentioned it in the beginning, but remind us of where to find your work, your columns, where to find you on social media, and things like that.
Okay. Do you want me to say that now?
Yeah. Just how.
Yes. Yep. I write a
way to
regular
follow
column
you.
for the Independent of London, which is at independent.co.uk. I write things that are called long reads for them as well, which are sort of bigger, longer features. I write for the sort of libertarian left of centre website called Spiked Online. I write for the right of centre Spectator blogs, and I do interviews for Sky News, sometimes for the BBC, and just really as and when things are in demand. And I'm doing 2 panels next week, one for the Institute of Ideas, which is quite a free thinking sort of outfit which runs debates, and I do debates for them quite often. I'm doing a debate on the Ukraine situation, and anyway, then 2 or 3 speaking things that I've got to do in the next week or so.
And then you're pretty active on Twitter, right?
I'm very active. Well, I've been particularly active on Twitter through my camera seems to have, I've been particularly, can you hear me?
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay.
I've
been particularly active on Twitter through the whole Ukraine crisis, because it just seemed to me that the situation was just so mad. It was being talked up so irresponsibly on every side. So I rather upped my Twitter profile, and I'm at Mary Dejevsky.
Great. And I'll make sure that I have all the correct links for those. I'll put them in the show notes. Again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you too.
Okay. Take care. Have a great weekend.
And the same to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Mary Dejevsky. Follow her on Twitter at Mary Dejevsky, Dejevsky. Read her columns at The Independent and at Spiked Online and at The Spectator. Also look for her writing and appearances on various media outlets. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com, find the various ways that you can get access to the bonus content and to support the show. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe, leave a review, it helps. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay strong.